So I want to continue with this discussion of kind of Judaism, right? We saw that the term Judaism comes from Judah and the story of God's dealing with his people, kind of the movement from a family to a nation in slavery, to a nation rescued from slavery, to a nation in a land kind of as a confederacy of tribes, to a kingdom, to the collapse of two kingdoms at the hands of two different imperial powers from outside, and then a return to kind of rebuild a temple, and these divisions within Judaism. And I mentioned in closing that really the what we see as Judaism today is rabbinic Judaism is rooted in the group known as the Pharisees. And a lot of their practices are going to come out of the experience of exile, of diaspora, and a sense of a promise of God's providential care. So I want to get into that because modern Judaism doesn't look like the ancient Hebrew sacrificial temple-centered faith. It's not totally disjointed, and I don't want to make it sound like it's something radically new, but there are significant differences because, for one thing, they're missing a temple and they're missing a priesthood. So where does this kind of modern Judaism come from? What does it focus on? A lot of Judaism is focused on ethics and kind of personal responsibility. The Bible itself includes legal injunctions, wisdom narratives, moral lessons, prophetic teachings, and just the stories of these people, right? But many of the commands in the Torah, the law, the first 5 books, are really problematic for modern Jews, right? There's no sacrificial system, there's no temple, there's no priesthood. Where do you take all these offerings? How do you go to Jerusalem to celebrate these holidays when there's no temple to celebrate them in? How do you live in a world absolutely surrounded by Gentiles in a sort of separate way? It really is a challenge. Obviously, there are prophetic exhortations to lead a good life, to honor God's covenants, but God's covenants were connected to the law, to the temple, to the priests, to the kings. Those are all gone. So how do we kind of live out this halakha, this walk of life? Well, there's something we'll talk about later, the Mishnah. These are teachings. And one famous teaching is the Sayings and Ethics of the Fathers. It's an important ethical text, but it's not found in the Bible. So where does this come from, and how do we know how to apply all these biblical texts when we have no point of reference? The kind of the history of this goes back to where we were last time, right? So you see this exile time in Babylon and Persia, time under Greek rule, and then but it comes to a culmination with the destruction of the temple. 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and not only is it destroyed, the Jews are dispersed. They're not just taken in a group off to Babylon to maintain as a group, they're dispersed around the world. And so this dispersion, they're called the diaspora, the Jews in dispersion, spread everywhere, with no home to return to and no hope of returning. How do they maintain their identity? What is the basis of their faith? They look to, if you look at that year 347 BC, this is the time of the Great Assembly begins. This is a tradition of rabbinic Judaism. And this has to do with how we interpret text. The Great Assembly was believed to be a collection of religious leaders, of rabbis, who, after the construction of the temple, kind of guarded and maintained the scriptures, guarded traditions passed down from the great reformer Ezra. Ezra was this prophetic figure who helped rebuild the temple. He was a priest. who helped rebuild the temple under the Persian rule. And he reformed certain things. He kind of helped reestablish worship in line with the law, but based on the circumstances of the day, with the new temple and the lack of a king and the lack of self-rule. How to deal with people. So you had people who were fully Jewish parents, maintained their lineage, maintained their customs as best they could in Babylon, who came back devoutly religious, kind of separated from other peoples, very Jewish. And they came home to find the poorer classes of Jews who had been left there had intermingled and intermarried, and they had maintained some of their traditions, and they had let go of others, and they didn't have a real understanding of the word. They didn't have there had been at one point priests sent to worship God, but they were not well-educated priests, so they not only kind of tried to practice the worship of God, but they also worshipped other Canaanite gods at the time. So Ezra came back to Israel to that kind of setting, and he reformed, he kind of purified, he helped with the rebuilding of this temple, and reestablished kind of a Jewish ideal and a Jewish identity and worship around a temple. And so these reforms of Ezra, the Great Assembly are these group of religious leaders that try to maintain that, try to kind of codify that. And this is what's going on with exile and diaspora. Though they're back home, this temple worship period is influenced by the fact that they're under foreign rule, and from that point on, they're never really fully self-governed, with a very, very short time span of exception. At sometimes they're able to worship, at sometimes they're persecuted, but they're never really self-governed. So when you get the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the scattering of all the Jews, the dispersion, you have this real problem, and what the religious leaders look back to are some of the practices from the exiles in Babylon, the writings from the stories that happened while in Babylon, Esther and Daniel, and the reforms of Ezra that had to do more with kind of personal holiness, ethical instructions, personal kind of religious purity. And so these reforms rooted in what Ezra had done, and this great assembly becomes the foundation for the group of the Pharisees that we mentioned last time, right? So I said at the end that the Pharisees kind of became the rabbis according to their understanding of rabbinic Judaism. The rabbinic practice of Judaism today is rooted in, they claim, in the world of the Pharisees, and kind of law and ethics teaching, and trying to apply things that would seem to only apply to the temple to daily life in exile and in Persian. So that's that rabbinic Judaism rooted in those Pharisees. And those Pharisees, as we mentioned previously, were rooted in the Torah. So we have the traditional Torah scrolls. These are the writings of, so technically the Torah means the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Oftentimes it's used as a label for the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures, including the major and the minor prophets, or the former and the latter prophets, the Nevi'im, the wisdom literature, the Psalms, those types of things. Oftentimes when they talk about the Torah scrolls, they mean the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. Technically it is just those first 5 books. But the Pharisees were very much a literary culture, a Torah scroll culture. But again, that problem in the Torah has all these commandments, right? But what do you do with, okay, some of the commandments are easy enough. Some of the stories are easy enough to apply, but what do you do with all these tons of commands that have to do with how to sacrifice an animal and what kind of animal to sacrifice and when? When you have no temple, you have no priest. So the focus comes partly on the Ten Commandments and what the rabbis enumerate as 613 commandments found in the Torah. And then what we call rabbinic Mishnah and Gemara, which expand on the commandments. And there's an emphasis on justice and love in the community, in the community of the faithful people of the Jews. What are Mishnah and Gemara? Where does that come from? And how do we do this? So it goes to the story, again, of the kind of the rabbis. Right, so 66, the Jews revolt, and at this point, the Sadducees have had it. So they're no longer, the priests are no longer kind of trying to resist revolt. Like I had mentioned, they are willing to eventually give their lives for the temple. And they see this revolt as the chance to throw off Rome. And so the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. And this causes like this permanent transformation of Judaism. The temple was the place of meeting between God and the people. People would come from all over the Roman world to Jerusalem at various times to celebrate. If they couldn't come themselves, they would send representatives from their hometowns, wherever they were dispersed. The temple was still there. They could pray towards the temple. They could look to the temple. They might go to the temple a couple of times in their lifetime. They could send offerings to the temple. But now the temple was gone. The priests were gone. And what was left? What was left was these rabbis, these teachers, particularly the Pharisees, who focused on trying to elaborate the commands of God, trying to explain them and then figure out how to apply them. This is what they had been doing in the synagogues. The synagogues were these places of worship wherever there was a Jewish community. So in these synagogues, these rabbis become key leaders, most of them having descended from these Pharisees. And so they begin to separate themselves from Christianity. You have to remember, we'll look at Christianity more in the future, but the first Christians are all Jews. Jesus is a Jew. Peter, James, John, the disciples are Jews. Mary is a Jew. Paul is a Jew. These are Jewish people, and they're claiming not some new religion. They're claiming that Jesus is the Christ, is simply the Greek word anointed, Messiah, that Jesus is the figure that all the Jews had been looking for. That's the claim. And you begin to see, whereas early on, you find Jews who believe in Jesus worshiping in the temple, and Jews who don't believe in Jesus worshiping in the temple. You find Jews in the synagogue who think Jesus is the Messiah, and Jews in the synagogue who think Jesus is not the Messiah. Fairly quickly, some persecutions arise, and there's this separation process. And especially as the Jews who are following Jesus come to the understanding that they have to be accepting of the Gentiles. There's a kind of a pushing away from that. So for about 400 years, about 300 years, there's this separation process, really over the 400 years. As more and more Gentiles become Christians, fewer and fewer Jews become Christians. And then Christianity becomes the official faith of the Roman Empire. And eventually the empire begins to kind of discriminate against the Jews, which is, there's this sort of anti-Semitism going on. Now, we have to distinguish. We read anti-Semitism through the lens of the Holocaust. The idea of race that the Nazis were kind of promoting and that created the Holocaust is a somewhat foreign idea to the ancient world. The Jews at this time, there were people of Jewish ancestry who became Christians, who were perfectly fine in this context. So it's not based on ethnicity or parentage. It's based on belief system. So when we talk about a sort of anti-Semitism going on in the legal structures, whilst in no way do I intend this as a defense, it's always wrong. Understand this is in a world where up until the 1700s, really, maybe in some places in the 1600s, everywhere in the world, you showed your loyalty in part to your nation by embracing the religion of your leaders. That's the huge importance of the idea of the separation of church and state. Was not, when at its inception in the Americas, separation of church and state was not about keeping the church out of the state. It was about keeping the state out of the church, because there had been so much of a practice of persecuting people for their religious beliefs because you suspected them of political disloyalty because they didn't religiously agree with the national leaders. This is fairly commonplace. It's why Christians were persecuted by Romans before the Romans converted to Christianity as officially, right? There's huge amounts of persecution of Christians early on because the Christians won't worship the Roman gods. They won't worship the community gods. They have to worship the only one God in Jesus Christ. The Jews had a special kind of dispensation under Roman rule for a while, but after the revolt in 66 and the destruction of the temple in 70, the Romans were no longer patient with the Jews. Before the Romans ever became Christian, they lost their patience with the Jews because they saw the Jewish commitment to their one God as a danger and a threat to the stability of the state. And that's pretty common. The Code of Justinian does kind of contain discriminatory legislation, but that's rooted in ancient sources. Furthermore, we do have a kind of a back and forth relationship here between Jews and Christians early on. One of the great kind of Christian theologians, St. Augustine, told people not to persecute the Jews because he saw them as a witness to the truth of the gospel. Their presence in the world as Jews was a witness to the truth of the gospel, and I can't explain all that right now, but just understand we often read these things through a lens of kind of the Holocaust in Germany, and that really gives you a misunderstanding of what is going on. Now, what went on does eventually contribute to the problems and the failures and the evils of the Holocaust. There's no doubt about that, but you can't read it backwards. You'll misunderstand what was happening. Jewish scholars fled. There's a Bar Kokhba revolt after the revolt of 70. I think it's around 125. I may have my years wrong. I'm pretty sure it's in. No, it's not on that list. But around 125, there's this Bar Kokhba revolt, and this one really finally finishes off any sense of a possibility of rebuilding a temple. It was one last-ditch effort to try to retake the homeland, retake Jerusalem, rebuild a temple, and it fails. Simon Bar Kokhba is killed. He was believed by some Jews to be an actual Messiah. He was going to set up the Messianic kingdom in the world and kill all the Romans, and it didn't happen that way. So many Jews fled. They went back to Babylon, which was not under Roman rule. It was under a Persian rule. There was still kind of a weakened but existent Persian empire in Babylon. So that was the place where many Jewish scholars sought refuge. And there's this kind of Jewish intellectual community that develops there. And this is where we get what's going to become the source of modern Judaism. The Mishnah is the collection of teachings that explain the Torah, which leads to the formation of the Babylonian Talmud. Now, to be clear, this is a kind of historical approach to this. Many of the kind of the conservative and traditional Jews will tell you that the Talmud came from that period of the Great Assembly. and we'll get to that later. But it's found in Babylon because Babylon is outside of the Roman control. Many Jews fled into various regions controlled by Rome, but it's in Babylon, outside of the Roman control, and with a smaller influence of Christians. The Babylonians are not Christian for the most part. There are some Christians there, but in Babylon is where Jewish kind of scholars can thrive without much competition. They're still seen the way they were under Cyrus to some degree. You're kind of worshiping this good God. That's fine by us. Maybe we'll get favor. So that's where this Talmud is, and we'll learn about that more next time.